I'm Amanda, and I am a current and pretty long-time MacEwan student. And as part of MacEwan's Ending Sexual Violence campaign, I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the core values that resonates a lot with me, because it's important in my everyday life, and ultimately it's vital for ending sexual violence more broadly. And that value is consent. So what does consent mean to me and look like in my everyday life? For me, it means that I make a concerted effort to be aware of and especially respect what other people do and don't want to do with and around me. That includes creating space for people to share openly with me what their boundaries are and know that I'm going to respect them, but also being open to constantly communicating what our boundaries are and allowing everyone involved to create really clear lines of how they want our interactions to go and what they want from our relationships. And I think for a very long time, I held kind of a common misconception about consent in thinking that it's only relevant in sexual situations. But what I've learned in the last few years is that consent is something that we constantly practice in everyday non-sexual situations. And because of that, it means that consent is something that I should be really actively trying to practice within not just my relationships with partners, but also with my friends and my family and acquaintances. And ultimately, having consent as a foundational part of my relationships is a matter of making it mutually enjoyable for everyone involved and acknowledging and respecting everybody's right to choice over themselves, their bodies, and their relationships. So how do I practice it then? I think how I've practiced consent has changed a lot since realizing how relevant it is to all sorts of situations, whether they're sexual or non-sexual. But there's a few tips that have helped me a lot in my journey to sort of implement consent more readily. The first important tip that has helped me a ton is getting comfortable with just straight out asking people what they want. I think oftentimes there's this idea that asking people what they want can be awkward or uncomfortable, whether it's in a sexual situation or non-sexual. But what I've found is that it's actually a really wonderful way for me to really clearly show and communicate to people that I care about what they want and what their needs are, and that I'm especially willing to respect whatever boundaries they set with me and respect their consent. The second tip is, I guess, just being soft with yourself and finding ways to cope with being told no. It's really easy for me to say, just get comfortable asking people for consent. But I also recognize that it can feel uncomfortable and it can hurt sometimes when we're rejected and told no by people that we care about especially. But it's really important in these situations to remind ourselves that when someone says no to us, it's less about them trying to insult us and more about us going out of our way to respect them. And especially for me, it's reminding myself that their rejection isn't a representation of my worth overall, that I'm still worthy, I'm still important, and they still probably like me. They're just setting that boundary with me. And that's really helpful for me in being comfortable saying no. And a big reason that I think it's important to be comfortable with being told no brings me to the third skill, and that's not making a big deal of it when people do say no. I think there's this sort of gut reaction when we're rejected to make a big deal of it, or for me especially, I'll be kind of sassy and like, well, okay, whatever. And really fighting that instinct is important, because I never want people to feel pressured to say yes to me unless they truly want to say yes to me. And having those big reactions can make people uncomfortable saying no when they don't want to interact with you in a certain way. So not making a big deal of those no's can go a really long way. And the fourth skill is just being flexible and open to change, knowing that everyone has the right to change their mind, and people quite often do change their mind about what they're comfortable with. In fact, COVID is a really good example of how those boundaries, especially with physical interaction, can change really suddenly depending on the context. So it's really important that we're constantly checking in with the people around us to make sure that we're respecting their boundaries and taking their consent into consideration all the time. And ultimately, I think those 4 things take a lot of the pressure away from people to say yes. And that way, at least in my life, I've found that now that I know people are comfortable saying no to me, when they do say yes, I know it's truly because they want to say yes. And that's really fulfilling and has created relationships that are a lot more trusting and ultimately healthy. And lastly, I just want to touch on why it is that it's important for ending sexual violence as a whole. And I think for me, my thought process is that if the majority of us are actively applying consent in all of our individual relationships, then eventually we'll have a larger culture where consent is prioritized and actively practiced in all sorts of relationships, and then ultimately is the foundation for relationships. In doing that, it affirms that people's boundaries are important, and in fact just as important as our own boundaries and wants and needs, and encourages all of us to play an active role in everyone else's comfort and safety and happiness, ultimately creating relationships that are based in respect and everyone's right to choice. And I think when that's the foundation of our relationships, the idea of violating someone's boundaries so intensely through something like sexual violence becomes really unthinkable. So I hope that inspires anyone to sort of think a bit more about consent in their life and maybe new ways that they can practice it, and in different relationships. And good luck this semester. Thank you so much for listening.